Franz Mesmer's animal magnetism was the idea of there being an invisible and energetic force connecting all living and non-living beings, which he hoped could be used for healing. This later came to be known as mesmerism. The etymology for the word mesmerize stemmed from Mesmer himself. This idea of mesmerism, however, influenced the Catholic priest Abbe Faria, who went on to develop his notion of hypnosis. To Faria, hypnosis worked through the power of suggestion. Thus, all essentially is guided by the inner workings of the mind and imagination. This will become important when we consider how the heart relates to the head as well as the pneuma or spirit. This, of course, would later impact early psychoanalysis in the form of hypnotherapy, which even Jung used for a brief while before abandoning it, since he could not understand how it worked for a particular patient. Indeed, as Land noted, complexes of patients are called such since they are too complex for psychologists to understand. But let us look to other ways in which the heart opens itself up to us throughout history. To start, let's look to myth and meme magic. In philosophical terms, Hecate's name etymologically means will, or working one's will, linked to the fulfillment of prayers. We can tie this will to the will of both Crowley and the world if we wish. Others have linked Hecate to the Egyptian goddess Heket, who had the head of a frog and is one of the members of the Ogdoad. Though Kek is preferred over Heket for meme magic practitioners, I find Heket is just as well suited. And one not need to note the obvious influence that meme magic has had upon the human mind, where via hyperstition fictions can make their way into facts. Remember, as we discussed in a prior video, thaumaturgy is merely the application of magic to change the physical world, and thus conjure something into creation. Once again, here we see occult concepts being used in ways that affect the physical world and its well-being, specifically in political terms when one considers Pepe's link to the Trump campaign. And so the occult too conjures things into creation through its craft from a political perspective, right? A form of demonic summoning. Again, as we brought up with hypnosis and Faria, it is this mesmerization through the power of suggestion that sculpts perspective, which then influences how others come to act. We could see this akin to speech act theory by J.L. Austin, for example, or perhaps the term gramarye, right, which connects to glamour, grammar, and grimoire, as well as occult necromancy. So like curse words and spelling words are nothing after all if not spells and curses themselves. As noted by Lewis Spence in the magic arts in Celtic Britain, poetry and words and knowledge are always linked to making magic. Linked to, of course, the wise men, right, the Zoroastrian magi who came to the newborn Christ. It was Heket who was believed to have breathed life back into Horus at birth, important in Crowley's system, connecting her to the rebirth process, as Horus was seen as the resurrected Osiris in some myths. So again, life, death, and rebirth or resurrection come to the forefront, tied to breath. Some also tie Hecate to Heka, who is the god of magic and medicine, or healing, right, which makes one whole via sex magic, of course, if we consider Crowley. But who existed basically before duality existed, thus linking him to the monad as opposed to the dyad. So he's usually depicted wearing a hem crown, which has 3 atefs, which are feathered crowns and which are tied to Osiris, as well as the Trinity, with them being 3 of them. So Heka could also blind crocodiles as well in certain myths. So the crocodile is linked to both positive and negative things in Egyptian mythology, tied to Amit, the devourer of the dead and eater of hearts, linked to the dead and thus the dangers that the Nile could present, as well as the judgment of the soul, since the heart would be weighed against Mot's feather of truth, and if the heart was heavier, the heart would be eaten by Amit, denying one eternal life. So Sobek was a more positive deity linked to apotropaic magic, which protected those from the Nile's dangers. So again, the heart would be weighed against the feather of Mot as a form of judgment for the Egyptians, determining whether one could enter the afterlife or not. If not, then their heart would be eaten by Amit. So to the Egyptians, remember, the heart was the literal seat of one's soul, linked to thoughts and emotions as well. And while some equate chem, the black lands, to the dark arts and alchemy, the term alchemy could also come from the Greek chemia or the Arabic al-chemia, meaning to transmute metals. We've noted how the word fantasy stems from fantasia, which is the inner mind, tied to pneuma, breath or spirit, as well as a spoken magical word. The heart links up to the pneumatic mind, tied to fantasia, which correlates to phantasm, and thus the word phantom or ghost. In the Atlas video game Persona 5, we see our protagonists call themselves the Phantom Thieves. By stealing one's heart, the Phantom Thieves are able to bring about a mental change in the antagonistic characters, forcing them to confess their crimes and thus cleanse their conscience, akin to the trickster archetype that changes their fate or destiny via occult practices like Tarot. Remember where Tarot links to Rota or wheel, as noted in the Chariot Arcana, as well as the Wheel of the Zodiac, thus tied to astrology and the cosmos. The cleansing of conscious, and thus the spirit, since the spirit is linked to fantasy via pneuma and spoken word, is of primary importance in many spiritual schools of thought. And though there are distinctions between the head and the heart, as Culiano notes in Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, both relate back to breath and thus the pneuma or spirit. As such, the heart also acts as the main means of communicating with the outside or spiritual world. To Plato, the human head is the microcosm of the cosmos. The heart is the seat of emotions. It would be the Stoics who would associate virtues with purity of the heart, however. Furthermore, purification would occur through theurgy, which we previously discussed in relation to thaumaturgy. The white magic of theurgy would later be practiced by Iamblichus, and the Neoplatonists used to unify a person back to the one or monad. This obviously, as we have previously discussed, was highly influential in Gnostic teachings, as well as institutes like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and thinkers like Aleister Crowley, linked to the astral body and one's holy guardian angel. The heart was thus the place whereby one could reunite with God through knowledge of the inner mind or gnosis. The spirit or pneuma is akin to a two-way mirror of water, reflecting both above and below, uniting macrocosm with microcosm, akin to Crowley's notion of abrahadabra, where the C is replaced by an H, meaning Horus, in the word abracadabra, being the word of double power or double articulation, akin to Deleuze's lobster god. We have already noted how Jung tied the waters to the unconscious, and how the waters of baptism help one be reborn, as it were in the Christian sense, becoming other. In another Atlas video game, Metaphor Re-Fantasio, or Re-Fantasy, which again is linked to Fantasia, a mechanical heart with a microphone is ripped out of each character when they awaken their persona-like powers. As Culiano notes, the act of purifying the heart, akin to the Phantom Thieves stealing the antagonist hearts, is linked to many spiritual and magical systems. For example, in Hinduistic thinking, the pranas, or vital life energies, withdraw into the manas, the inner mind, where the heart is the dwelling place for divinity and thus intelligence. Taoism, as well, has a similar function tied to the purification process. The purification of the soul is prominent in alchemic and hermetic thinking, linked to the philosopher's stone. In thelemic thinking, we can relate this to the death and rebirth process of the Knight of Pan. The cleansing of the heart is also noted in Sufi mysticism as well, achieved through Persian mantras, again as noted in Culiano's work. As Land notes in Shamanic Nietzsche, everything Bataille says seems to come from Christianity, where evil is linked to the heart of erotic love, eros, which is only one of four kinds of love in the Greek sense. This explains Land's acceptance of not eros, but of thanatos, or death. Even Christ's crucifixion, which we have often equated with a limit experience, to Land is trivial compared to the torture of being God, as existence itself becomes desecrated or non-sacred. Thus, the sacred can be preserved through sacrifice or nihilistic annihilation, a return to zero or nothing, a Nietzschean nihility, which to Land can be seen as a divine way of thinking, where God is dead. This is the god of death, or Bataille's Solaranus, the black and alchemical sun of occultation and eclipse, the nugredo stage of putrefaction. Through death and decay, something new, however, can always be reborn. If we consider John the Scot, however, this nihil god of lands, which man calls to due to being born from nothingness, right, thirsting to return to nothingness via annihilation, but it may not be as separate from the Christian god as Land thinks, if we consider John Scott. Either way, to Land and Bataille, hell, right, is no longer an innocent underworld. It's no longer just tied to Ulysses' return, or Persephone and Hades, or rituals like the Eleusinian mysteries. With hell, Christianity, via Dante's Inferno, brings forth damnation, linked to fire and flames. Of course, we can note the symbolism of the flames linked to alchemic transmutation and transfiguration, the act of becoming other, as well as rebirth, the flames of the phoenix. As Bataille notes, we have nothing else to do in the world but burn. To Land, this Nietzschean death of God, via Bataille's black sun, i.e. transgression outside the law via erotic and ruinous passion obtained from the accursed share, that, while, quote, an experiment in damnation, is not necessarily criminal. Transgression is tied to our fate or destiny, driven by the noumenal will connected to the cosmos and the stars, which calls to us from the future. Thus we approach the impossible via shamanic state, Bataille's limit experience, where the divide between pain and pleasure is blurred, like as noted in Clive Barker's Hellbound Heart, influencing the character D.C. Barker in the CCRU writings. Still, the Hellbound Heart is not entirely heartless. Promethean fire will always be needed to fuel the Gnostic and alchemic flames of becoming other, as Heraclitus noted, where all is flux and flow. Christ's Sacred Heart is often depicted burning with a flame, and in some Gnostic schools he is seen as the main vehicle in which to obtain gnosis, the Promethean fire of the mind. Then on top of that, there's a whole notion of hypostatic union as well, where the divine and human nature of Christ are unified into one being. To Kierkegaard, this paradox, which is beyond reason, required a leap of faith. And yet there is distinction between spirit and mind. The Holy Spirit, the pneuma or breath, is the third aspect of the Trinity, distinct from the Father and the Son. See John 15:26, where the Spirit is noted as the helper who comes from the Father, to quote the King James Version, "But when the Comforter is come, whom I will send unto you from the Father, even the Spirit of truth, which proceedeth from the Father, he shall testify of me." Furthermore, as noted in Romans 8:6, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." It is from this carnally minded aspect of flames and fire by which death and damnation can also be derived. Even Christ's Sermon on the Mount is often equated with the Buddha's fire sermon to some, where, as Matthew 5:29-30 notes, it's better that only parts of a person perish than that their whole body be cast into hell. In Buddhist terms, desire is the source of all suffering, while to delude, it's a productive force, aiding one in becoming other through the body without organs. In many ways, it could be argued that the hellbound heart is necessary for purification purposes. I will need to explain Land's philosophy real quick so we can see the connection to the law, both as Land and thinkers like Giorgio Agamben discuss it, pertaining to the catatonic state of exception. After the law references Land's anti-utilitarian outlook as backed by Bataille's ruinous excess attained from the accursed share, leading to decadence and decay, where transgression is not a misdemeanor to Land, but rather it's the genealogy of the law itself, hacking the organized human security system of Oedipal inclinations and psychoanalytic repressions, embracing instead schizoanalytic and machinic desires in the act of becoming other. Akin to the zero, death is needed before one can be reborn as something other after all. It is this passion of ruinous intensities, as noted in the acts of Gilles de Rais, whom Bataille wrote on, where sacrifice is linked to the sacred, that will transform the human being into something other, via Deleuze's body without organs, leading to a smooth line of flight, right? Reaching a limited experience via Bataille and getting outside, led on by Kant's noumenal will, which infects us vampirically through its bite, morphing immanent man into it. Man becomes inhuman, escaping human order and organization, and inexpressible, right beyond words, akin to a Lovecraftian creature where language is lost. This transcendental alien outsider who is alienated is thus above the law, acting as the true will of the world, which to Land takes on the form of techno-capital, since capitalism is synonymous with AI to Land, which calls to us via virtual hyperstitional time travel, where fictions become facts from the future, akin to a Cthulhuian calling. Now that we understand this, we can link this idea of being beyond the law to the heart and the sacred, where transgression is outside the law, tied to Bataille and noumenal forces. And so, let us conclude this essay. The reason men today make statements like having a change of heart or letting your heart decide has to do with these magical and spiritual ideas. The fifth element, or quintessence of alchemy, is the philosopher's stone, linking above and below. Through the ether, or pneuma, or quinta essentia, the human soul rests in the heart, entering the body through spirit. Again, to Plato, the heart is the seat of our emotions, for what takes place in the heart is linked to the phantoms we find in Fantasia, linked to fantasy, allowing us to unite with God through gnosis and be spiritually cleansed. As we noted previously, man thinks in an anthropomorphic or humanistic manner, so much so that he can even link his heart to a form of gnosis, or as the Greeks did, link the polis to the cosmos for the cosmopolitan lifestyle. But as such fantasies come to fall with the loss of the Anthropocene age, so too does Fantasia fade, taken over to Alulian technique and inhuman technical magic, corrupting man akin to the ring Morgoth had made. To Land, such a heart is hellbound, but not heartless. Though language is limited, it is never fully lost for finite man. It is only lost when taken over to infinity or true transcendence. Man, therefore, remains mesmerized by technology as a finite creature, hypnotized by it to such an extent that his heart has become hellish, interacting more now with a machine than his fellow man. Like Hetren noted, it is the interaction between the finite, immanent, and infinite transcendental that the third concept is created in the act of becoming other. But even with Morgoth's magic, though hellish, one is not left heartless. As long as man remains mesmerized and hypnotized by technology, it is assumed that he still has a heart. And so, as long as mankind does not become heartless, he can still hope to attain henosis, bound to the act of becoming by way of the magic in his mind, which allows him to communicate to the spirit and get outside, whether that be through an immanent manner via his unconscious, or in a more shamanic or transcendental sense. After all, if we are to consider anything from Aztec culture, the heart, since it was the seat of life, was offered up to the sun god as a form of human sacrifice, tied again to the sacred. It was believed that sacrificing such human hearts would keep the sun god sustained. Here we see Batai's accursed chair, due to the excess of the sun, present itself in full force, tied to ruinous passions of religious ecstasy. Though hellish, the sacred is thus always heartfelt, where sacred links to saker, meaning to set apart for the gods, as noted in sacrifice, linked ambivalently to things both holy and accursed, linked to the accursed chair of Batai, which, as we said, is tied to the sacred via sacrifice. Also, as we brought up with Giorgio Agamben, a homosaker is defined as one who is outside the law, that cannot be sacrificed, according to the Romans, connected to the katachon and sovereignty of Carl Schmitt. Hence why Land calls his essay After the Law, as Land's philosophy does nothing if not connect to the transcendental outside, while backed by Batai's sense of transgression, which is also outside the law, akin to the homosaker. But, unlike the homosaker, who cannot be sacrificed, Batai deals with the sacred via sacrifice, making it eschatological. Like Marxist reification, we have turned the katachonic system into an eschatological one, as Marx was an eschatological thinker, as Jakob Thebes noted. We can thus escape the state of exception and the katachon in this sense via the accursed chair or the black alchemical sun, dying so as to be reborn eschatologically. And thus we see the connection to the heart, to the mind, spirit, hypnosis, mesmerization, henosis, fantasy, magic, Promethean fire, and alchemic purification, the holy and accursed, the sacred and sacrificed, as well as the state of exception, and thus the katachon and eschatology, tied to our very breath of being, which allows us to become something other than what we currently are, since the soul, or spirit, is also tied to the egg, upon which, as Crowley noted, one is always vampirically sucking upon for sustenance. Perhaps this is why people feel as if their soul is being sucked out by technological systems, as the Fang Noumena feeds upon our psyche and spirit, eating us away as we are bound in the egg of becoming, akin to the caterpillar dissolving away in its cocoon before it is reborn as a butterfly. One need not fear the clap of the thunder words and the thunderclouds that form in Joyce's wake, as they are alchemic and Gnostic in scope, tied to technology, awakening the alien in us all.